Good afternoon everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Now I'm out in the garden filming this voiceover, but it is very windy today, so hopefully the muffler on the mic and everything else will cover most of that. But it's after 5 and the kids are feeding animals and I got sidetracked, and so I'm out here doing it now. So hopefully it'll be all right. So today's video is a video about beef trim that I buy from Costco. So when I do my 6 weekly grocery hauls, I buy a box of beef trim from Costco. Not everyone, I skipped one, and so sometimes I skip a month grabbing it. It's a bit of a variable size. This month was this box that I'm using was, I think, 16 kilo box. There was 2 8 kilo vacuum sealed bags. I think the one that I got before that was like 22 kilos. So it really just depends on what the box weight is. It is $9.99 a kilo, and it is the trim that they use to make their mince. So basically it is what they mince, and I asked them the question. They mince it through twice. They do it on a coarser grind and then a finer grind, and that's their mince that they sell in Costco. So when I buy mince, I struggle a little bit to get through it because it's something that has to be gotten through fairly quickly, and it bleeds everywhere and it's just annoying. So I thought that I would ask about if they sold the beef for me to mince myself, and then I could use it as mince or however I wanted it when I wanted it. And because it's vacuum sealed and it's beef, it can sit in the fridge, in the coldest part of the fridge, for a couple of weeks if that's what's needed. So I asked at the butcher and they had it, so I buy a box of it. Now, when I got it, I wasn't sure what was to be expected. So this is 80-20, 80% meat, 20% fat, because that's how they sell their beef mince. So I wasn't real sure what I would be getting the first time. So when I first opened it, I was pleasantly surprised that there's quite a lot of roasty, meaty bits in there, like chunks of meat, not just the offcuts. Of course it's all offcuts because it's can't be sold as roasts, but I was pleasantly surprised by what I got. So what I've taken to doing is going through the beef and cutting out some diced beef out of what I've got to use for some things, and then mincing the rest of it up and using it that way. So I had an 8 kilo bag, and I decided that I was going to use it up and figure out what I was going to do with it, and then I would film it along. And what I ended up doing was getting 5 different meals out of this beef. So what I'm going to show you is more than 5 meals, because we ate multiple of these meals multiple times. But what I'm going to show you is the 5 different ways that I turned this box of beef trim into meals. So this, as I said, this is $9.99 a kilo. A kilo is 2.2 pounds. So I might try and work out the US dollar per pound price and put it on the screen. Which is a fairly inexpensive meat for us. Not the cheapest, but for beef it's fairly inexpensive. So come along and see what I got made out of all of this. I thought it was kind of an interesting concept to share with you what we did out of that beef. So come along and I'll show you what we did. So as I said, I open up the bags and then I assess it as I go. So it was an 8 kilo bag. I pulled it out of the bag in the pieces that it comes out. It comes in various different offcuts of roast. I don't know enough about butchered meat to name the pieces that I'm getting. A lot of it has silver skin on it, and it has fat lines through it as well as on it. And so what I'm looking for the stewed beef is a little bit of fat on the top, but not necessarily sinew through the middle, and I don't really want silver skin because I'm not going to be cooking it long enough for all of that to break down. Be different if I was going to be slow cooking it over a really long time, but I'm not necessarily going to be doing that. Not that I know what I'm doing with it at this point in time, but so what I'm looking for is the nice, really the leaner pieces of beef with a fat cap, and cutting them into chunks and putting them aside, and everything else I'm just cutting into the size pieces that will fit through the grinder. So I just went through and cut it all up and split it into 2 different bowls. So the first thing I used was the chunks, and I decided to make a pie filling out of this, a steak and mushroom pie filling. So I coated the chunks in some flour with some salt and pepper and cooked it off in lard in batches in the cast iron Dutch oven. So you want to be putting batches of it in to cook because you want it to fry off, not to stew. So you don't want to crowd your pan or you'll have too much liquid and the meat will stew. You want it to fry off and have those, nice crunchy dark brown bits of flour and meat left behind in the pan because that's flavour. I sliced up a whole bunch of onions and carrots while cooking the meat off in batches, and then as each batch of meat was cooked, I put it into a baking tray just to put it aside and kept on going through the pan. I diced the carrots up not too small because I knew I was going to cook this for a fair length of time, so it didn't matter if they were a bit chunky, but if you were only wanting to fairly quick cook it, then you might want your veggies a little bit smaller. I added the onion and a bit of fat to the pan to caramelize it. So what you want to do is caramelize your onion, and then if the pan's a little bit dry, you want to add some fat, so that's going to bring up those bits of crunchy bits and flavour in the bottom of the pan. So I added a little bit of lard in when I added the onion in to try and break that up. And then once the onion was slightly softened, I added the diced carrot, a bag of frozen mushrooms that I had in the freezer. I'm not overly concerned about the texture of mushrooms. They don't freeze very well and defrost very well, but because it's going into a pie filling and it's going to be cooked for a couple of hours, I was more concerned about adding them for flavour than texture, so it didn't really worry me. And to be honest, I don't really like the texture of mushrooms, but I don't mind the flavour of it, so this is probably optimal for most of us because the kids aren't overly keen on the texture of them either. So I put the bag of frozen mushrooms, the diced carrots in there. I put a bit of homemade Worcestershire sauce to help deglaze the pan and add some flavour, and a bit of water. I could have used stock here, but I didn't have the jar open yet, so I just added a drizzle of water, and that's just to moisten everything up and get all those crunchy bits off the bottom of the pan. Then I added the beef and any juices that were left in the tray from the beef into the pot as well, and mixed it all up. I added a jar of the chicken stock that I had canned. I brought it up to a simmer, and then I put the pot into the smoker for the rest of the day. I don't know if I show it coming back out anywhere, but it reduces by about half. It was in there for 4 or 5 hours. Reduced by half, was lovely and dark, and you'll see it again when I use it anyway. And at the end of the day, it went into the fridge to cool because you want it cold to be putting it in your pie pastry anyway. So this was for the next day. So I'm going to cook it all up today, let it cool a bit on the counter, and then stick it in the fridge, and then I can use it the next day. Once that was sorted, to slow cook for the rest of the day, so I stuck it in the smoker because the smoker is easy to hold a low temp. So I put it in the smoker to slow cook for the rest of the day. And then I shaped the burger buns from the dough that I'd made first thing in the morning. I didn't show making the dough, but I made it first thing this morning and warmed it and proofed it in a warm spot. This is one of the hybrid starter and yeasted doughs because I forgot to make the dough the night before, or I hadn't planned on what I was doing for dinner the next day. So it's got starter in it, but it's got a bit of yeast in there as well, just so that it can be used in the same day. So I shaped them into 16 buns, which is 2 each, which is either if someone wants 2 burgers with dinner, they can, or we have spare burgers for breakfast the next day. And I did have breakfast burgers the next day, this particular one. I shaped them into 16 buns and put them in the trays to do their second rise before baking. They're about 90 grams per bun, and I put them spread out so they're nice and flat and hamburger shaped, not high. It's a slightly enriched dough, not quite a brioche, but it does have some oil and stuff in it. Once they go into those trays, they get covered and the trays get put somewhere warm again until they double. Once they're doubled again, I glaze them with a little bit of egg yolk and I put some sesame seeds on top, and then they get baked for later. So it's an all day sort of a thing, but being able to do them same day is really handy as well. After that, I minced up the rest of the beef. I had put it back in the fridge, but it probably needed to have had an hour in the freezer. Because it had a lot of the silver skin and stuff, the mincer was working pretty hard, and if it's chilled or par frozen, then it will go through your mincer easier than if it's getting warm. Now this obviously wasn't warm because it had been in the bottom of the fridge. It was cold. It needed to be a little bit firmer, I think. All I did was I babied the mincer a little bit. I cut the meat down into smaller chunks where needed, and I watched it, but it did get a little bit mashed up coming through the grinder rather than nice shaped sort of a grind, because some of it was getting a little bit stuck around the blades. At one point I did pull the whole piece apart and clean any silver skin that was stuck around the blades and put it all back together, but it worked in the end. It just had to be a bit aware of it. If I had have stuck it in the freezer, then it probably would have made things easier. Now as we come into summer, anyone who's been here like last year and the year before as well will know, but as it comes into summer, we're in Australia and my kitchen doesn't have walls. It has some shade cloth around it, but it doesn't have solid walls, and that means that I get flies because it's Australia. So I do as much as possible to not show footage where flies are landing on anything, because I know that it grosses some people out, but I can't always avoid them. And for us, You don't want them sitting on anything. You don't leave anything exposed. You put covers over things when you walk away and all the rest of it. But flicking flies away while you're cooking is very, very normal. So I apologize to anyone who finds it hard to watch, and I do try and not show it excessively because I know that some people do find it hard to watch, but it's not something I can avoid completely. I pulled 1.8 kilos aside and put some onion flakes and salt into it and worked the meat a little bit so it would hold together for hamburger patties for dinner. I put a cover on it and put it in the fridge for dinner for later on. So that was 1.8 kilos done. I do 1.8 kilos because I do 90-gram meat patties, and that's enough for everyone to have 2 patties each. And Darryl and I tend to have slightly smaller patties and have 2 on our burgers because it's nice to do that. So I put that in the fridge for dinner. I pulled out another couple of kilos of the mince. I added a jar of caramelized onion jam, some eggs, some Worcestershire sauce, onion, garlic powder, salt and pepper, and some breadcrumbs from the freezer. I also added a few of the cracklings from the lard that we'd rendered to add in there as well with the breadcrumbs. Worked it together until it was quite malleable, not too wet. Added a bit more breadcrumbs if needed. I don't want it overly wet, so I want it to hold together a little bit, be moist, but as I said, not too wet. The caramelized onions are going to add a bit more liquid than I would normally have in there, the jar of them, because there's a bit more liquid in the jar than if I had caramelized them on the stove, but it'll all even out in the end. I really like to use leftover bagels as the breadcrumbs for this. I tend to, if there's any stale bagels, I will turn them into breadcrumbs in the Thermomix, stick them in the freezer, because then I get all those seeds and seasonings and stuff in the breadcrumbs, but also it's a nice thick, so a large, light and fluffy sort of a breadcrumb, which I find is really nice for this sort of thing because it creates these little air pockets in it. I pulled out puff pastry from the freezer. We buy these bulk packs from Costco. They're vegan, so they're dairy-free, and they're fairly inexpensive. Puff pastry is not something I'm overly keen to make myself, especially if I'm trying to do it dairy-free. Definitely find it easier to just buy it from Costco. Cut the pastry in half and then place the mince down the middle of each half, rolling them up snugly into the pastry once it was done. I cut each log into 4, mainly just because it cooks quicker, and I like those crunchy ends of sausage rolls that you get when they're cut like that. You can cook the full logs, you can score them and then cook the full logs and then cut them on the score lines, or you can just have them as whole logs, however you want. I just find cutting them into 4 means that it cooks quicker and we get those little crunchy bits on the end of each one. Especially with this caramelized onion jam in there, it is going to be a little wetter than my normal mix, and it's going to allow for some of that moisture to go on the trays. It'll burn a little bit potentially because there's sugar in the caramelized onion jam, but it's going to spread out and burn rather than create soggy sausage rolls. So cutting them is a good idea in this one. I filled a tray with them, egg washed them and sprinkled them with sesame seeds and put it in the oven. I then filled another tray whilst the first one was baking to put in afterwards. I will say I'm using the hooded barbecue. I don't have an oven. Using a hooded barbecue here to cook everything, so there is some inconsistencies in heat and stuff, which makes it difficult sometimes and means I can only fit a tray and a half in the barbecue at any one time. Looks like it did show the pie filling. So this is after it's slow cooked all afternoon. It's lovely and rich and dark and thick and reduced, and the meat was just sort of falling apart in there. So that was what we were aiming for. So I think it was about 6 hours that it sat in the smoker, just sitting at like 150 degrees. 150, yeah, about 150 Celsius. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it was sitting at. Just slow 100, 150, I can't remember. It was low because it was in the pot, the lid was on the pot, and it was just sitting there. I didn't think about it, but I probably should have used the Wonder Bag, given that a go. But anyway, I used the smoker for it. This is what the sausage rolls look like when they come out of the oven. I actually prefer pork mince over beef mince for these. I find it's more tender. It's a bit softer sort of a mince. The beef has got a little bit more of a chewy sort of a mouthfeel, but it works either way. I would also normally cook up the onions fresh and caramelize them in a pan, because then you don't have the extra sugars and the extra liquid from the jars. But I would normally have put bacon and celery in there as well and made sort of a mix of those. What's it called? A mirror pox kind of thing. And cooked all that up first before adding it to the mince, but I didn't have any celery in the freezer or the fridge. And we don't have any bacon. So that's why I just went the easy route and used the caramelized onion jam from a jar. After they were cooked, it was pretty much time for dinner to be started. So I used 90-gram balls for the patties. I really like to use my tortilla press to get that smash patty kind of thing going on. I find it easier than trying to squish the balls in the pan, though I have been looking at buying myself one of those cast iron presses, which might solve a lot of my problems and might work quite well if I oiled that and used that. But for the moment, I haven't bought one. So using the tortilla press with some greased baking paper works really well for that too. I cook them off until they're nicely caramelized in the hot cast iron. I like doing it in the tortilla press because it spreads them out and then they shrink into a good size when they're cooking. Darryl was helping and he was making them up for the kids, and I said I needed to film one of the buns being cut open, so he obliged for me and did it on camera. So here he is cutting open one of the enriched sourdough discard, I suppose, hamburger buns that we had with a dinner, and this is what the burgers looked like afterwards. So being late in the month, there's not much in the garden to serve up. We basically just had meat burgers. There was tomatoes, plenty of sauce choices, as well as caramelized onion jam, mayo, all that sort of thing. But I went super simple today. Darryl had bought me some sliced burger cheese from the hamper last month, so I pulled that out of the freezer, melted it over the patties as I cooked them, and used a bit of ketchup. I have no idea how there is ketchup left 5 weeks into the grocery run, but there is. Basically had a double cheeseburger. I didn't even think about it. There is pickles on the shelf. I could have pulled some pickles out and put some pickles on it too, but you know. The next day I started off by making pastry for the steak pie filling. So I do a very simple pastry in the Thermomix: 400 grams of flour, 110 grams of iced water, 60 grams of olive oil, and 60 grams of lard. I bring it to a small ball stage and then bring it together a bit more on the dough mat. I shape it into discs and put it in the fridge until I need it. This freezes well as also, so it's great to have on hand. I should make it more often and stick it in the freezer, because sometimes I think about having pie, but it's far too late in the day to chill the dough before rolling it out. So if I had a couple of balls in the freezer, that'd probably be a good idea. I had all of the rest of the mince left over and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it. There's bolognese in the freezer, there's already mince in the freezer as well, so I kind of wanted to cook it into something so that it would be used as a meal. I decided to make a basic pie filling, but mince based, rather than the chunky steak pie. So I did a similar thing to the steak pie filling. I caramelized off some onions in a pan, added some diced carrots. I had a bag of frozen zucchini in the freezer, and because we're using mince, we have the opportunity to use the zucchini without too much hassle, so I put the zucchini in there. I cooked all that up until it was soft and defrosted, and then I added the mince that I had left. It would have been a couple of kilos. We're talking probably, so we used almost 2 kilos for the hamburgers, almost 2 kilos for, or 1.2 kilos for the sausage rolls, I think, and then 1.5 kilos for the steak pie. So there might have been 3.5 odd kilos of mince left. So I put all the mince into the pot as well and cooked the mince off with all the vegetables. Once it wasn't pink anymore, I added a jar of chicken stock, a jar of tomato paste, added a glug of Worcestershire sauce. Once all that was mixed through, I added some of the Maggi rich gravy powder. So you could totally use a flour slurry here to thicken it up, but the flavour addition of the gravy is nice, as well as the thickening agent, and I have it, so I decided I would shortcut and use it. I let that simmer for about 15 minutes and then I put the lid on it and into the fridge once it was cool enough. As I said with the steak pie filling, we'd want the pie filling to be cold when we're putting it in pastry, otherwise it can make your pastry go soggy. So pie filling is always made either first thing in the morning and fridged for the day, but preferably overnight is good to get the temperature right for it. I spent a couple of hours in the garden after that, or doing videos or something, because there's a couple of hours gap between the videos, and then came back in to start dinner. So I pulled the pastry out of the fridge, rolled it out for the pie, used my cast iron pan that fits a nice deep dish pie into it. I rolled the pastry nice and thin, placed it in the dish and gently pushed it into all the corners as needed. This pastry recipe is very forgiving. It stretches nicely, it's easy to handle, it's short and flaky without being overly short. It doesn't need excessive chilling, but once it's chilled, it still has those little fat globules that you can see in the pastry. I really enjoy using this pastry, and I used to hate pastry, so I'm happy with this one, very much so. The pie filling wasn't enough for 2 pies, but it's probably a little generous for one, but you know, I made it work. I filled the pie dish and then rolled out the other half of the pastry and put it over the top. I trimmed the edges, basically tucked the top into the edge of the pan, crimping the two layers together as much as possible to create a little bit of a seal. My pies aren't always aesthetic, but they are tasty. I don't go to a whole lot of effort. I did have some really nice pie dishes that had fluted edges and things like that, but they were stoneware, and using them in the barbecue they all cracked. Because it's an open flame underneath where I'm cooking, stoneware is not optimal for it, so I need to buy enameled cast iron or stainless steel or things like that. So enameled cast iron is the best for pies, I've found. The bottoms of the pies don't tend to burn because the heat is good in them, so that's what we use. I cut a slit in the top for steam to escape and put it in the oven or the barbecue. I have a Bluetooth thermometer, so all I did was shove that in the middle of the pie so that it would tell me what the internal temperature was, because I didn't glaze the pastry or anything, and being homemade pie crust, it doesn't always brown up as nicely as others, so sometimes it's hard to tell when it's cooked. Internal temperature is the best way to tell. We served the pie with mashed potato, which had some ghee and some salt in it, and just some steamed frozen veg. So we ate that entire pie in one sitting with the mash and veg. That was dinner for all of us. So that the steak pie filling and the pastry was one meal out of the beef that we got. On to the next day, and I have that minced beef pie filling to do something with. I thought it might be nice to do individual pies. The idea was to make individual pies and then freeze them. And then they could just be pulled out of the freezer and heated up at whim, maybe while I'm shopping and stuff for the kids and Darryl and stuff. That was the idea anyway. So I don't have any individual pie tins at the moment, though. I did have a look online, and there's some really nice commercial oval ones with the flat edges. I think that would be really nice because that's a decent size, more filling to less pastry size, and there was a catering place that sold them for like $1.50 each, so I think I'll order myself some of those. But I did have some nice deep muffin trays, and I had just bought these in an online sale when I had bought something else, and it was free shipping because we needed some new muffin tins. These were a nice deep muffin tin, so I decided to use those. As I said, I'll probably buy some individual muffin tins because this went individual pie tins because this went down well, but this worked for this meal. I made another batch of my standard pastry, the same 400 grams of flour, 110 grams of iced water, 60 grams of olive oil and 60 grams of lard as the previous batch, and put it in the fridge for a couple of hours. When I was ready to cook these, I pulled it out and rolled it out into a rectangle. I ended up using my Fowler's Vicola canning lids to get the sizing right. So because it's kind of hard to roll pastry out super thin, it bounces back on itself, especially when it's chilled and all that sort of thing. I rolled it out as far as I could, then I cut the circles out using the 4-inch Fowler's lids. After that, I rolled each of those circles out a bit thinner and then tucked them into the lightly greased muffin tins. I collected all the scraps and re-rolled it out. The more you handle it, the less it's going to want to stretch out nice and thin, and the more you are incorporating the fat into the pastry. So you really don't want to work the pastry hugely if you can avoid it, but you also don't want to waste it. So rolling it out once or twice is just, what you end up having to do. I lined all the muffin tins, and this used half of the pastry. So it was 200 grams of the pastry, which is the same as the bottom of a family pie, or a top, whichever one. It was half of the pastry. I then filled the tin with the chilled pie meat mix, making sure to dome it slightly above the top of the tins. I then filled the tins with the pie mix, making sure it domes in the middle, because you want the pie mix to be nice and full so that the pastry doesn't collapse. You want it to dome rather than collapse. So I used the store-bought puff pastry for the tops. Now this is partly because puff pastry is really tasty, partly because I wanted to get another tray of pies done. So I wanted the other half of the homemade pastry for the other tray. I now know how much I get from a batch, so if I wanted to use the lard pastry on the top as well, I would know how much I needed to make for the trays, except that I'm looking at buying those individual pie tins, so that'll be an all new calculation for that anyway. I used the 3-inch Fowler's lids for the tops, and I just cut as many as I could out of the pre-rolled sheets. I then just sort of domed them over the pie filling and tucked them in to the sides, tucking any extra lard pastry up over those middle bits as well, and to make sort of little self-contained pies. Now the gravy wasn't excessive in these, so it shouldn't spill out over the muffin trays too much, but you do want to create a little bit sort of a cup so that all the juices are staying into the pastry. I put a little slit in the top of every pie for the steam to escape, and then put them in the barbecue. This is what they looked like once they were cooked. Pretty good for being done in muffin tins. They look kind of neat. They're just kind of small, but they were pretty cool. They came out of the tins fairly easily, though I did need to use a knife to find something thin enough. I was just really careful not to scratch the pans because they're my brand new pans. After those pies, I still had a fairly large amount of mince left to use. I contemplated freezing it in the muffin tin size pucks. Darryl suggested that to make more pies later. But I didn't really want them half made in the freezer, and once I've frozen them, theoretically you make your pastry, you have to put the frozen in, you have to cook them. You can't then and eat them. You can't then cook them and then freeze them and eat them again later, though the new standards of freezing and refreezing and thawing food is different, and it probably is fine being beef. But generally speaking, you only freeze things once if you can, between cooking and things like that. Like, if you only freeze cooked things once if you can. So I'm also hoping to get the individual pie tins soon, and if I get those, then those puck sizes wouldn't be the correct size for those pie tins either. So I just decided that I didn't really want to do that right now. I can buy more beef and make more pie filling once I get the individual pie tins. So instead, I made it into some pasta bake. I cooked up spiral pasta, I split it in between 2 trays, then I split the meat between the 2 trays as well. I mixed it fairly well through the pasta. I made a white sauce in the Thermomix and then blended some egg yolks through it to make it a creamier colour and slightly better flavour, and then poured it over the top of the pasta bake, a bit like a pasticcio. I put some vegeta in it, some mustard, some garlic powder, salt, pepper, all that sort of thing, like a bechamel sauce, but with those egg yolks in it. So you cook it first in the Thermomix for the first 9 minutes till it thickens up. Then I added 4 egg yolks for the 1 litre of coconut cream that was in here, and cooked it for a few more minutes on 37 degrees just to temper those eggs into the sauce, and poured it over the top. It also makes it set up a bit like cheese when you bake it. Those eggs make the cheese sort of set into more of a... So the eggs make the white sauce set into more of almost a cheese mix. I sprinkled the top with some breadcrumbs that were mixed with the cracklings from the rendering lard to give that sort of salt and crunch on top of the pasta bake, and then put them in the oven. Once it was cooked, it came out a bit like a pasta bake or lasagna. Everyone enjoyed it. It was very tasty. We decided to have a bit of each meal for dinner because we could. So we had an individual pie with a scoop of the pasta bake each. So out of that bag of beef trim, we made a steak and mushroom pie that was one meal's worth. I made 2 full trays of sausage rolls, which was 2 lunches worth. I made 2 full trays of individual pies, which ended up being dinner and lunch the next day in those. And then I made the 2 trays of pasta bake, which was dinner one night, lunch the next day, and then I think there was always also some leftovers for some of us to have lunch the next day with it as well. Was there anything else in there that I missed? Because that doesn't feel like enough. Pasta, pies, sausage rolls, steak pie, and hamburgers. So we had hamburgers as well. So 5 meals out of that beef, but sort of like, and we also had hamburgers left over the next day too. So there was some for lunch the next day as well. So we sort of had 2 meals out of the hamburgers, 2 meals out of the sausage rolls, 1 out of the steak pie, 2 meals out of the minced beef pies, and 3 meals out of the pasta bake. So I got 10 meals out of that, maybe $80 worth of beef trim. So you're talking $8 a meal for 8 people. It's $1 a head. So I think that works out pretty well. Obviously there's more costs in there for the other stuff that went in there, but this is just a random breakdown and it's more for my benefit than anything. I like to think about those sorts of individualized pricing so that I can assess whether the work is worth it for what I'm doing, basically. Is it worth mincing my own beef and turning it into 5 different meals and serving them all up? Does that save me money, or doesn't it? It costs me time, but my time is my choice, sort of thing. So anyway, that's what we do with beef trim from Costco, or one of the lots of things that we do with beef trim from Costco. So if you're interested in getting it, all you have to do is knock on the butcher's door and ask for a box of beef trim. You can only buy it by the box full, so whatever's in the box is what you get. But it's beef, it's vacuum sealed, so it lasts for a couple of weeks in the fridge anyway. Personal preference on that one as to how long you're happy to leave it, or you can throw it in the freezer, or you can mince it and then throw it in the freezer, anything like that. But yeah, I find it kind of neat. So thank you for joining me again today, and I will see you on the next video. Bye guys.